Hello, and a very warm welcome to this latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. On today, a fallout within Labour. Keir Starmer says no to compensation for the Waspi Women. That's put him on a collision course with his Scottish leader, Anas Sarwar. We will chew over the background, the politics, and the economics of a decision which is proving very problematic indeed for the Labour government at Westminster. And it was also comes on a week when the former First Minister, Humza Yousaf, decided that he would not contest the Holyrood elections in 2026. We'll reassess his legacy. And his predecessor as First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, well, she's been giving interviews this week to mark the anniversary of the passing of equality legislation in relation to gay marriage. Was it a wise interview to do? We'll chew over that. And Nigel Farage, what's he been up to with Elon Musk in the United States? But first, to the issue of the Waspi Women compensation, the announcement from the Labour government that they would not proceed with the compensation as recommended by the Parliamentary Ombudsman. Now, Alex, just take us back through the broad timeline of this story and really, at the end of the day, what's at stake? What's it all about?
Well, there are a number of things to talk about in relation to this, Bernard. I mean, there is the politics of it, which we'll get onto. There is the economics, the financial aspects of it, and there is the justice of it, actually, as well. The question as to whether the Waspi Women, the women campaigning for compensation because they weren't informed of changes to the state pension age, the equalization of the state pension age, and that they should therefore be compensated for the loss of their state pension. I think on the latter front, and so on, they actually have a very difficult case to make because the changes to the pensionable age were announced in a little covered speech by Ken Clarke in 1993. This was the budget speech. It was hardly hidden away. And the legislation to do this was introduced into the House of Commons in 1995, but nothing would actually happen until 2010. So people were given 15, perhaps arguably even 17 years to make their sort of life, work, and pension choices. There were, it is true, subsequent changes to the pensionable age introduced by the coalition government when George Osborne was Chancellor, and those took effect on a shorter timeline. And it's the failure of the DWP to inform people there that makes the case for maladministration. Even though there was plenty of press coverage, you could look it up online and so on. It wasn't exactly a secret, but it did probably inconvenience some women born in the 1950s. But the level of compensation recommended but now rejected by the government was only between sort of £1,000 and £2,000 per person. It wasn't the £50,000 that lots of Waspi women have been claiming has been somehow stolen from them. I think that is a ridiculous claim to make, by the way, that they have had £50,000 stolen from them, and the cost of compensating them for that would be absolutely astronomical. No government could sign off on that. But, the politics of it are obviously rather different from whether you think the government has taken a fair decision here, which I actually think they have. I think the Waspi campaign has been deeply fraudulent from the beginning, because I do not think that 15 years is a short period of time in terms of being given notice. But the politics of it are obviously very different, aren't they?
Yeah, because there was nothing in the Labour Party manifesto on this. And rather interestingly, will the Conservatives make a pledge to compensate these women should they win the next election? I would suggest that they will make no such commitment because no responsible opposition would start spending money before it knows the state of the public finances. And it's the state, of course, of the public finances that are driving all of this. The government is saying that if it accepts the amounts of compensation which are recommended, it will cost the government £10 billion. Now, some of the people within the Waspi campaign, at the time when these recommendations came out, said that an appropriate compensation figure would be £10,000 per head, which would have led to a bill for the public purse of £36 billion. There would be no chance under any circumstances that any government would exceed to £36 billion worth of public expenditure, and absolutely no way that the government would do that, given they have no fiscal headroom at the moment. Do I have some sympathy with some of the women? I do. And we can come to the politics of the decision making in a moment. You're absolutely right. And you gave us the timeline there. And this was long discussed and long debated and long written about in the financial papers of newspapers. Now, for 15 years, I was a trustee of a pension scheme, and I can tell you that most of the communication that goes to members, despite the fact you put it in the most empirical of language, a lot of people simply don't get this. It is actually quite technical. Now, there may well be many people, and of the 3.6 million people who are affected by this, there may well have been some people who did not get their letter in a timious manner, who have perhaps taken decisions and not known when the state pension age was going to be. And they may well have taken pretty fundamental decisions, for example, moving from full-time work to part-time work. Then they're hit with this, and then they find that their retirement plans have been thrown into chaos. But you're right on the substantive point that there is no sense in which people are diddled out of money as a consequence of change. Now, my state pension age is 67. It used to be 65. Am I going to argue that if they'd kept the state pension age at 65, that the government have diddled me out of 2 years of state pension? No, because eligibility is related to a specific age, and there is no suggestion here that people are not being paid the correct state pension. And indeed, if someone's state pension is found to be erroneously calculated by the DWP, this is all the people who are not affected by this kind of change, DWP are normally pretty quick in actually making up any shortfall if there has been a miscalculation. But Alex, the political point, and I've tried to give some statistics there that put this into the broader public expenditure part. This was not in the Labour Party manifesto, wasn't in the Conservative manifesto either. It raises a question: when is a betrayal a betrayal? Does it have to be in the manifesto in order to be a betrayal? Or have Labour betrayed the Waspi Women, given, frankly, what most Labour politicians said in the run-up to the election?
Well, again, I mean, here again, we have the difficulty of people in opposition making easy promises to particular interest groups, and then finding that when they're in government, those promises come at significant cost. It is almost as though nobody has learnt from Nick Clegg. You remember Nick Clegg making a great deal about the Liberal Democrats' opposition to university tuition fees. Then the Liberals get into government, which came as a significant surprise, obviously, to many Liberal Democrat supporters who did not think they were voting for a party that was interested in being in government. That was the great betrayal, as far as they were concerned. But then, Clegg obviously U-turns as part of the coalition government on tuition fees, and the Lib Dems take an awful hammering as a consequence, and in reason, in certain respects, justly so, because that was a betrayal. And again, I think the Waspi Women, and so when they have, Anna Sarwar, Liz Kendall, all these Labour politicians and so on in opposition, sort of being photographed with the Waspi campaigners, saying, yes, of course, we support a fair settlement, blah, 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 blah. It's very easy. It's a cheap promise to make in opposition, which is why, of course, the SNP have made so much running on this. People like Mary Black, Ian Blackford, Joanna Cherry, now Stephen Flynn, have hammered away, Alison Thewlis as well, have hammered away on the Waspi Women issue for years. Because, of course, it's very easy for the SNP. They're not going to have to foot the bill. They are not going to be in government in the House of Commons. So, it's a free hit for them. It's the opportunism of opposition politics, and that's fine if you're never going to be in government. But of course, the Labour Party is supposed to be a grown-up party that is going to be in government. And so making these cheap promises that are actually very expensive promises in opposition is a textbook example of how not to do politics. But one of the things that we have, I think, in the social media age in particular, is, campaigners come to Holyrood or they come to Westminster and they have their little placards. And they're little things for signs for politicians to be photographed alongside that then go out on social media. And it's all about brand building and awareness building and all the rest of it. And you sort of bully politicians into supporting these causes without thinking about it too much. Because if you don't, then you're a sort of cad and a bounder and a rotter, and a bad person. But again, the cost of delivering on these things is really significant. And so, of course, it's not a surprise that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn made extravagant commitments to the Waspi Women, because, again, Corbyn wasn't really interested in being in government and certainly didn't really think he would be. And so it seemed like a free hit again. But Anna Sarwar in Scotland is supposed to be interested in being in government. And I think that this issue is one where it does throw some of Sarwar's political judgments into question, because real leadership often requires you to say no to people, even people who might ostensibly be sympathetic. Although I think actually most voters will not be hugely sympathetic to the Waspi Women, because they will think that it's only fair for the state pension age to be equal and for it to be the pensionable age to be increased. You're right, it's going up to 67. It needs to go up to 70 pretty soon, really. And most people will think that being given 15 years notice is ample. So I don't think there'll be the political hit that some people think there will be for the Labour Party across the UK as a whole. But it's clearly going to be an issue that the SNP will hammer away, a bruise the SNP will punch time and time again over the next 18 months.
But you're right. All governments, all political parties make pledges, very often which they haven't costed and which they then have to abandon. And when the SNP were elected back in 2007, there was a promise to effectively eradicate student debt. Now, the amount of money that was required to do that was positively eye-watering. They had to drop the commitment. And, there are other examples of the SNP not going ahead with things because the price on the menu is simply too high. Every single government, whether it's devolved, whether it's a Westminster government, has to deal with how it allocates scarce resources. And really what should have happened in opposition is that Labour politicians should have been careful what they said before they knew the price that was attached to this. I mean, you cannot be standing at all of these demonstrations, and you can't have all of these people who are now ministers in the government having their photographs taken with these women, expressing solidarity, giving them the impression that if you vote Labour at the election, we will deal with this because the Conservatives are in power and are not committing to it. So I think that those women who make the charge that Labour have betrayed them, it is a charge that will stick. I am not convinced with your line that there perhaps might not be as much sympathy for these women among the wider public. I think the problem for Starmer is that it is yet another issue on top of other issues, with all of the stuff in the clause, with all of the stuff in the winter fuel payments. And by the way, the decision on the Waspi Women should not come as a surprise, because if Labour are prepared to take a politically sensitive decision on winter fuel payments, where the cost to the public purse is £1.4 billion, it's a no-brainer, frankly, in fiscal terms, that they don't go ahead with this because the cost is £10 billion. Now, this is an example of, sort of what Harold Macmillan used to refer to events, to your boy, events. It's one on top of another. And I'm not, I mean, of course the government can make the case. This is unaffordable. This is money which we would have to take from frontline public services, and we're not prepared to do so. And the levels of compensation that would be paid out to 3.6 million people are not transformational in terms of their lives, but we recognize that in terms of the maladministration, this was an injustice, and we apologize for this, although we cannot make the financial commitment. There is a way in which you can do this, but yet again, the government are on the back foot. Yet again, Anna Sarwar is sitting here in Scotland going, oh my God, this is not going to play well for me in 2026. John Swinney, on the other hand, in Bute House, is rubbing his hands saying, the narrative of my campaign for 2026 is not being offered by John Swinney, it's been authored by Keir Starmer.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is, yes, I mean, that's probably true. It just goes to show you that doing the right thing in politics, or at least doing the fair thing, which I think is what the government has done in this instance, and so on, good deeds never go unpunished.
Well, indeed, which brings us on, does it not, to the position now of Anas Sarwar. You made the point earlier that you think he's doing I suppose, the easiest thing, the populist thing, the thing which is fiscally irresponsible. And at the end of the day, and I think your argument would be here, Alex, that those kind of characteristics are bad characteristics in a politician who seeks to serve in the top office, because these kind of decisions about taking difficult financial positions with finite resources are the stuff actually of modern politics, is about the politics of choice, and that Anas Sarwar is on a different side of the argument for Keir Starmer in this one, despite the fact there is nothing he can do to mitigate really against it. He can simply say that he disagrees with it. But we now know where he stands on things like the two-child benefit cap and winter fuel payments. And at some point, he must simply ask himself that I can see why he's doing it, that he doesn't want to be outflanked by the SNP on a so-called progressive agenda in 2026. And he has to be seen to be trying to close some of this down. But the more this goes on, the more that he disagrees with Keir Starmer, people will simply say, well, if he has no confidence in the government at Westminster, why should we have any confidence in him to govern Scotland?
Absolutely, I agree with that completely, Bernard. I mean, there's a lot of talk, sort of fashionable opinion at Holyrood, I think, is that, that Anas Sarwar needs to have some sort of dividing lines with Keir Starmer. He's got to stand up for Scotland, for Scottish Labour's interests, Scottish Labour wanting to do things differently, and have an argument with the Labour Party, with the Labour government and so on. It seems to me that that is something that plays into the SNP's storytelling much more effectively than it advances Labour's own interests. If you have a Labour government in Westminster, then Scottish Labour's argument should be, look at what we can do if we work together. We have had, nearly 20 years of the Scottish government working against the UK government, and look where that has got us. How about imagining a different kind of future, a different kind of politics where the two governments work together in the Scottish interest? And that he should be making a case for what Labour is doing in the UK just now, and then what Labour could do in Scotland. And picking fights or sort of little dividing lines with Starmer's party seems to me to invite a sense of division, obviously, make Scottish Labour look small and inadequate and useless in certain respects. And I don't really see that it's a good idea. Vote for Scottish. We think the UK government, which is a Labour government, isn't doing the right thing. Vote for a Scottish Labour government that will do the right thing. I mean, it's just not a story that makes sense.
And what that does is that issue after issue after issue, where John Swinney will hound him in leaders' debates and so on, is that the Scottish election in 2026 runs the risk, and I put it no higher than that it becomes a de facto referendum on the UK Labour government. And the reason why this is doubly bad for Scottish Labour is that he's in an impossible case where he has to say, I am progressive in terms of how he is defining progressive politics. My colleagues in London on a whole series of issues are not. Doesn't he simply see the impossibility of trying to make that argument? But secondly, because the SNP and the Conservatives will jump on this bandwagon, it means that the election will not be about 17 years of the SNP in government and their stewardship of the economy and public services. So it's a double whammy of utter stupidity. And I really don't know what it is that Anas is doing in terms of all politics in terms of strategy is a chessboard. It's a chessboard. You have to think not the next move, you have to think 3 and 4 moves ahead. When you come out with a line, you have to ask yourself, is this line defensible? Is this line going to be ridiculed? And how might this line come back to haunt me? All issues of strategy, you have to ask yourself certain basic questions. And it doesn't appear to me that he's asked himself these questions.
And the other question about it is it the right thing to do? Which is a sort of unfashionable thing to consider, but is nevertheless an important factor. You're right that Labour's approach should be, the 2026 election needs to be a referendum on what by then will be 19 years of SNP government. And if they can make that the focus of the election campaign, then I think Labour have an excellent chance of doing quite well. If it isn't about that, if it is, as you suggest, more about how Keir Starmer is doing, then the SNP will be delighted to fight the election on that front. But speaking of the SNP and so on, and their record, I think it's no great surprise, is it, that Humza Yousaf has announced that he is not going to seek re-election in 2026. That has been the general assumption in Scottish political circles for quite some time, really, actually, ever since he stood down in April of this year. But now that we have this confirmed, what is your view on how history will judge Humza Yousaf, to the extent that history will be interested in doing so?
Well, I'd be interested to know, first of all, what it is he's going to do, because if one goes back through the history of former First Ministers, if you remember when Henry McLeish left Parliament, he took up some lecturing in the United States. He chaired one or two committees, particularly in relation to the future shape of the governance of Scottish football and so on. Jack McConnell became an active member of the House of Lords and kept his interest in the development of Malawi as a country. Alex Salmond took some interesting and indeed controversial decisions in relation to a future media career. The one thing that the history of this office tells us is that once you leave, people are not queuing up necessarily to employ you. So he must have thought about it carefully, because I would have thought that his marketability, frankly, is somewhat limited. How will it be remembered? I will actually remember the entire period, actually, for the day that he was elected First Minister, where there was a sense in which he was greatly moved about being the first Muslim to hold the office, about the symbolism of him becoming First Minister, and I don't think we can underplay that. It was extremely significant, and he made a contribution to public life, but I don't think it's one that was frankly all that distinguished. And I watched him since the time when he was a researcher to the late Bashir Ahmed. He was always somebody who had an eye on a political career, and frankly, an example of a modern politician who had an eye on a political career without having had a career in the first place, which I think ill-equips you to take decisions in office. I don't think any of the ministerial positions which he held in government, he particularly distinguished himself. And I think his lack of capacity and lack of judgment was the thing in the end that did for him, over that entirely nonsensical way in which he managed that relationship with the Scottish Greens. It was a prime example of how not to do government. And as I've said several times on the podcast, and I repeat again, because politicians are just human beings who come in and do public service, trying to do good. He's an incredibly decent guy. He's a guy, I think, on a one-to-one level who's without any side. I think he's empathetic when he deals with people. I don't think that at the end of the day, he has the intellectual capabilities and the personal toughness that's required in order to do a frontline political job like the First Minister of Scotland. Now, as you know, podcasts rely on the support of listeners and sponsors. And I'm delighted to say that we are teaming up with the Inverary Inn, a venerable institution in Scottish hospitality, and somewhere I'm pleased to say both Alex and I frequent when we visit.
Yes, and if you're not familiar with Inverary, it's one of the most picturesque coastal towns in Scotland, with its historic streets and castle, which have featured in many Hollywood films. It's only an hour's drive or so from Glasgow and a couple of hours across country from Edinburgh through some of the most picturesque scenery in the country.
And if you go there, you really can't miss the Inverary Inn. It's very, very conveniently located, and of course, with those absolutely stunning views of Loch Fyne. And we are also delighted that the good people at the Inverary Inn are teaming up with us with this special offer for all of the listeners and viewers to the Ponsonby and Massey podcast.
If you book a stay between now and March 2025, they will include a £25 dining credit to enjoy some of the hotel's wonderful Highland fare. Just quote the code podcast2024. That's podcast 2024.
Yep, that's a generous offer, and it's one which I am going to take them up on.
To find out more, just visit www.inverary-inn.co.uk or give them a call. As ever, terms and conditions apply. Yeah, I mean, affability and charm are not enough. You're obviously right in terms of his personal characteristics, the story, his story in terms of being a Pakistani Scot becoming leader of the SNP and First Minister. That is important and symbolic, and obviously very wild. So we had the spectacle of both the SNP and the Labour Party being led by Pakistani Scots. The Hutchisonian supremacy on the left of Scottish politics for a while. That yeah, yes, but when you look at substantive policy legacy and so on, there is not much there. And when you look at basic political grip and the ability to drive things through, to get things done, to set a clear direction, that wasn't there either. And I think that was obvious from the beginning, because of course we have to recall that the SNP was stunned by Nicola Sturgeon's resignation. This was not something that had been anticipated by many people. And suddenly there was a thing, well, who's it going to be? And John Swinney ruled himself out and said, well, no, come on, we should pass the torch to the next generation. And so then, well, who's it going to be? Kate Forbes, okay, fine. But then for all the well-known, well-trodden reasons and so on, there was a reaction against Kate Forbes. And so Nicola handed the torch to Humza. But the votes, relatively few votes were cast for Humza because people thought, well, he'll be a brilliant First Minister. But there were plenty of votes cast for him because A, he had Nicola Sturgeon's support, and B, crucially, he was not Kate Forbes. I recall one of Humza's colleagues in Glasgow, said, well, he's a lovely guy and so on, but I don't know anyone with a brain who's voted for him with any great enthusiasm. And that was before the leadership election, which Humza Yousaf won, of course. And that sense of foreboding, if you like, that this is not going to end well, turned out to be entirely opposite. And it's unfortunate the way it ended for him, but it ended for him because of through his own mistakes. And I would expect that his future will not be in Scotland, will not actually be in the UK either. I think it is quite clear if you look at where he has devoted his attention over the last year, that his future will lie in the Middle East, doing some sort of role there. Whether it amounts to anything really truly significant remains to be seen. But I would have thought that is where Humza Yousaf will find himself.
And I think that just to follow on from the point that you make, Alex, the sense within the SNP that perhaps he wasn't up to the job can, I think, be evidenced by, at the end of the day, how relatively close that leadership election was. And given the absolute pounding that Kate Forbes' campaign took in the early days, and the real difficulties that it had in the early days, that she came as close as she did, perhaps was more to do with the fact that a lot of people had real doubts about Humza's ability to do the job. I remember having lunch with a senior aide in the Kate Forbes campaign. This was just after the election, in which I'd said to him, the problem was that from her point of view, is that she didn't nail two things early on. She allowed herself to be presented without fighting back effectively to the view that she was just a Tory who was in the SNP. Now, I don't believe that to be true at all.
No, they've got Fergus Ewing for that.
I, I don't believe that at all, but the fact was that it was not effectively rebutted. And in some of these issues of conscience, she didn't explain the interface between her faith and her responsibilities as a public servant. And I think if she dealt with those issues early days, she might even have won that election. Such was the doubts among some people about Humza's fitness for that. But of course, the reason that we had the contest at all was the unexpected resignation of Nicola Sturgeon, whom herself has been making waves this week, Alex.
Yes, she's popped back up. Nicola Sturgeon has not been seen at Holyrood very much in the last year or so. She has not spoken in the chamber very frequently. She's been busy writing her memoirs, which are going to be an interesting read, because if nothing else, they will demonstrate, the extent to which there is a degree of self-knowledge from the former First Minister. I mean, I think, her anointment of Humza as her chosen successor is another thing which casts a degree of, a slight cloud on aspects of Nicola Sturgeon's own judgment. But you're right, she's returned a couple of interviews she's given over the weekend where ostensibly noting the 10th anniversary of the passing of the equal marriage legislation in Scotland, and quietly, sort of implicitly, essentially taking credit for the passage of that legislation, although, of course, the bill was passed by when Alex Salmond was leader of the SNP, and the Scottish government was very careful, I think, to make sure that there was no Scottish bill before or until the House of Commons, then led by David Cameron's Conservative Party, had passed its own bill equalising same-sex marriage, legitimising same-sex marriage, and I think that was something that smoothed the way for the bill's passage in Scotland, because it had already been done in England, and so there was really very little to be frightened about here as a consequence. But Nicola Sturgeon was sort of saying that she didn't think that any kind of debate on issues of this sort would be possible now. She thought it was quite civilized a decade ago, but now the temper and tenor of politics is so toxic and polarized and partisan that a similarly civilized, and that was her word, debate would be very unlikely, which I think says more about Nicola Sturgeon, actually, than it does about politics these days. But what's your view on this?
I'm intrigued by your view that about the memoir. I can't, for the life of me, think that it will be terribly interesting. And I don't say that in any sense to have a cheap go at Nicola Sturgeon at all. The reason I say that I don't think it'll be terribly interesting is that at the end of the day, when she was leading a government, it was, and I think this is accepted by the commentariat at Holyrood, it was effectively an echo chamber for her own views. What it wasn't was the kind of government that we had during the Blair-Brown years, where there was a sort of turf war between Prime Minister and Chancellor, between number 10 and number 11, and where a lot of things which we didn't know about at the time, we subsequently know about because of books from Anthony Selsdon and others who have written extensively about the relationships in that government. There was not a lot that appeared to me to be going on in the nature of fundamental divisions, where she's got a lot to sort of lay bare. And of course, the most interesting thing in all of this was the disintegration of the relationship with Alex Salmond. Now, we learn also this week that the legal case that Mr. Salmond was pursuing will continue to be pursued. So there are all sorts of legal reasons, and of course the branch form investigation still ongoing for a whole series of legal reasons. Anything that she has to say that might genuinely be of interest, I think the lawyers will put a red pen through. So I think this is likely to be a memoir which will reveal nothing particularly revelatory. She might get into sort of personal low moments. I suspect that the headlines from the memoir were all about how she was coping emotionally with the strains of office, particularly around the COVID period. But let me get your view on this. As a working journalist, I get why there's an anniversary and bids go in to interview you, and you think, well, that was quite important to me. I want to talk about that. But the headlines, from what I could see in a lot of the newspapers, were, I am none the wiser about where stands the branch form investigation. Now, those were always going to be the headlines. The idea that you could do an interview and not be asked about this is for the birds. And if you have any idea of the way in which journalists operate, that was always going to be the headline. And again, the purpose of doing that interview may well have been to mark for her a particularly important milestone. But in practical terms, it simply reminds everybody yet again of the pickle that she is in and the pickle that the SNP are in.
And the pickle her husband is in.
The bigger pickle.
Yeah, I mean, he's in a very significant pickle, a super pickle. Um, uh, branch form is in many ways unsatisfactory, regardless of where you happen to stand on Nicola Sturgeon, Peter Murrell, the SNP, or anything. So, this is an investigation that's been going on so long now that without, it seems, any prospect of conclusion, although we know that it is several months now since the police submitted a report to the Crown Office, but we haven't yet had the Crown Office's response to this report. The question as to whether they are actually going to go ahead and press charges against Peter Murrell and possibly against other people too. We don't yet know. And I think it is unsatisfactory that it's been going on so long. And there has to come a point where, enough is enough and, a decision has to be made. And the Crown Office, needs to make that decision and take the hit one way or the other, because there will be a hit, whatever it actually decides from one part of the electorate or one part of the political spectrum or the other. But you're right, Nicola Sturgeon, I mean, she, in some ways, it's unfortunate for her that she continues to sort of operate under this shadow, which is not necessarily of her creation, that it would be in her interest for there to be a resolution too. But the other thing I think that was extraordinary in the interviews that she's been going, is this deploring the sort of tone and temper of political debate. This notion that that everyone, that it'd be much better if we could just have a nice civilized chat about everything. And so, well, that wasn't the way Nicola Sturgeon operated when she was a frontline politician. And she was a partisan knuckle duster wearing politician of the first order. If you think back of her reaction to when Jo Swinson lost her seat. There's Nicola Sturgeon in front of a TV camera, and she knows she's in front of a TV camera, going rah. In a way that it's impossible to imagine a John Major.
She's not going to greet over it.
Well, no, but come on, it was fairly classless. You couldn't imagine Theresa May, for instance, reacting
Politicians
to
are
rivals of
classless,
people like that. Okay, but then admit it, acknowledge it. Don't try and present yourself as being better than the other people when you're not. And again, you had Sturgeon in these interviews. So, she was making sort of allusions to, say her gender recognition bill and so on, and the dark forces that were operating against her and so on, unnamed and so on. But her motives are always pure and unquestionable, unimpeachable. People opposed to her were bigots, possibly racist, homophobic, transphobic, all the phobes. That's in the same time as you're calling for a sort of more civilized discourse. Come on, I mean, the brass neck of it, to use a favorite Nicola Sturgeonism, is breathtaking.
I just wonder if she's lost a sense of her media savvy, because I think it was unwise to do these interviews, because although, as I say, they were about marking an anniversary, you can't say to journalists, you can't ask about A, B, C, and D. And let's be absolutely clear about it. They were more interested in A, B, C, and D than marking the anniversary. And it was I think a schoolgirl error to make in agreeing to do the interview. I think it was an error to do that ITV election nights results program. And I'm surprised by it because I can remember many, many, many years ago, again, all the way back to the early 90s when I used to present political programs. She used to sit in the audience and she used to make very measured contributions. And you could see the development of Nicola Sturgeon as a savvy media operator. She knew exactly the line of questioning that journalists would take. She could predict what they were going to follow. And not unreasonably, she would do interviews that were for the benefit of Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. I have no quarrel with that. I just think for someone who was so media savvy that latterly her judgments have deserted her. I think her political judgments deserted her around about the time of the Brexit referendum. And I think the loss of Noel Dolan as her chief of staff was actually a pretty big loss for her because I think he relied on her quite a lot. And I do think that whenever she does interviews now, and I don't say this at all to have a cheap personal go at her, I think in some respects she does look a diminished politician.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and so on. And it's sad. It's a sort of Enoch Powell type thing, isn't it? And that unless cut off in their prime, all political lives end in failure. It's the cliche, but it's a cliche because it's broadly speaking true. We are sort of beginning to run out of time, but we should, because we did advertise it at the top of the show, we should have a quick chat about Nigel Farage reform. I mean, this is professional podcasting here. We should have a quick chat about Nigel Farage reform. Elon Musk, the Reformed treasurer, has been scurrying off to Florida to meet Musk and so on, and amidst talk in the media of the suggestion that Musk might give through his UK subsidiaries reform £10 million, £20 million, even extravagantly £100 million. I mean, all change down the back of the sofa for the world's richest man, but would have a potentially anyway transformational impact on British politics. Is this British politics, British democracy for sale, Bernard?
Well, I mean, political parties can spend what they want to spend outside a regulated election period. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the Reform UK issue, as we've discussed before, is genuinely a fascinating one. I think the reasons why they do well is something which is beyond the traditional left-right divide in politics. I think they're capable of taking votes and it would be wrong to think that they're a party which is going to disproportionately harm the Conservatives. They did at the general election, but they've now got Labour within their sights. And some of the issues that we've been talking about on the podcast, and we come back to the difficult nature of taking decisions, the fact that the new Labour government are constantly on the ropes. There is a sense in which they got rid of the Tories after all of these years. Starmer was promising change. People don't see change. There's a lot of disillusionment around. They look as if they may well have their finger on the pulse of a section of the electorate. And there's no doubt that if you have an infrastructure behind you, regional organisers, full-time organisers, constituency organisers, money to do things and to get onto social media platforms, that it helps buttress your message. And I think in the next couple of years in politics, it will be genuinely fascinating to see what they do. And I think that the established political parties are frankly going to have to take them a bit more seriously and take them on politically rather than regard them as an irritant. They're a lot more than an irritant and are threatening to become a lot more than an irritant. And 2-3 public opinion polls in Scotland suggesting that they could even be players at Holyrood.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at the moment, Reform are polling well in advance of both the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party. I suspect that at some point in the next few months, we will have an opinion poll in Scotland that puts Reform third after the SNP and Labour, that will have a poll, only one poll perhaps, but which will say that Reform will win more seats at Holyrood than the Conservatives. that may not actually happen in 2026, but I think I will get a poll that suggests it could. There are problems for Reform in Scotland. I mean, they just had to bin their Scottish organiser and so on because of his family links to loyalist paramilitaries. And while that might be a vote winner in certain postcodes, it's not something that's likely to do particularly well in others. But it is more of Reform is a sensibility more than a coherent policy platform. If you look at council by-elections, it's winning 15% in Maryhill, other parts of Glasgow as well. So, this is not just a question of, elderly, disaffected Brexiteers voting for Reform. The question of Musk, obviously, if the world's richest man owning a still extremely significant and powerful and influential social media platform decides to be all in on Farage and Reform and to fund the party legally, one would have to say, through his UK subsidiaries and so on, that will, I think, bring into cause an enormous amount of disquiet across the political spectrum, and lead to all kinds of calls for the further regulation of political spending, for, I would argue, probably further restrictions on political speech, actually, as well. Because it will be a game-changing type thing. And I think one of the things that politics hasn't really managed to catch up with yet is the way in which social media now, it's not just Twitter or X, it's TikTok and YouTube and all the other alternative platforms, have increasingly supplanted the traditional news media as the drivers of political stories and the political mood. And that is something that I think we see is quite clearly the case in the United States. It's increasingly the case in the UK. And I think that people are completely unprepared for it. And so to that extent, the question of Musk and his money is, if you like, secondary to that broader change.
Yeah, and as somebody who made my living for decades in the mainstream media, and that term, mainstream media, tends to be used as a term of abuse now, rather than an accurate description of where organizations, newspapers, and broadcasters stand in the media landscape. I have been very, very conscious that, 30 odd years ago when I started out, there was a high degree of trust in what broadcasters in particular had to say. And part of the Reform UK agenda, of course, is you cannot trust what they're telling you. You cannot trust what broadcasters are telling you because they're punting a certain degree of the world, or a certain view of the world. And that's why that I say that the more mainstream political parties, rather than ignoring them and regarding them as an irritant, have to start taking them on and have to start interrogating some of the pledges that they make. But as we've said many times, I think that we should probably actually devote an entire podcast to why they're polling, where they're polling, who's supporting them, what they really believe in, what they say about the nature of our party system, trust in politicians, and the nature of our democracy, and perhaps get one or two Reform UK people on just to explore a little more about what they stand for. But we've given it a good run this afternoon, Camry.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there we go, listeners. And so on. If an episode devoted to Reform doesn't get you wanting to subscribe to the podcast and share it with friends and family and so on, what possibly could? This is something for you to look forward to in the new year. It has been splendid having you with us again on this episode. Do please spread the word about the podcast. Leave a review on Apple or Spotify and so on if you are enjoying it. And do get in touch with us at ponsonbymassey@gmail.com or on Blue Sky or on X, where again we are Ponsonby Massey. It would be lovely to hear from you. But Bernard, we'll be back in a few days with a review of the year. But until then, it's been lovely chatting with you again as always and so on. But until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.